For a lot of people, they call themselves Christian, but the truth is they don't practice the faith, right? It's Christmas and Easter only. They're CEOs. It's kind of a hobby. But when you start talking about being a disciple of Jesus, suddenly that's not a hobby, that's a way of life.
Yeah. Well, hey, everybody. Welcome to the podcast. And Chad, welcome back to the podcast. You had a little hiatus this last week as you had a family member pass away. Sorry to hear about that.
I did, yeah. I went to Texas. Everybody's going to have some kind of memorial service or funeral, right? We're all headed in the same direction. But my uncle passed away and got to go back and celebrate his life and talk about the grace of Jesus in his life. So it was kind of a bittersweet thing. But overall, it was a good thing. I'm glad your brother Chris joined you last week.
Yep. Yeah. Last minute shoulder tap. I'm like, hey, man, it's a long shot, but what are you doing at this time on this day? And could you come out for 20 minutes and do a podcast? And he's like, sure.
Yeah. So I'm not going to lie. I haven't listened to it yet, but I was a little fearful that once Chris was on, nobody would want me back. So thank you, Chris. Good job.
No, he has like 4 other full-time jobs. So I don't think your job's at risk here.
Well, I know he's a busy guy.
So you went out to Texas. You got to spend some time with family out there. As a pastor, anytime there's a funeral, I'm always like, oh no.
Yeah,
like,
it's always a little bit weird because you're playing 2 roles. Because do I have my pastor hat on right now, or do I have it was my uncle? So do I have my nephew hat on, or my cousin hat, or my I'm the son of my dad. That was his brother. So yeah, it's a little weird when you're a pastor.
Yeah, and even just the fact of doing a funeral, like weddings are one thing. Weddings are fun and it's celebratory and everyone's smiling and it's like, man, just pour a ton of money into it, and then you do a funeral service and it's like, it's exhausting. At least for me personally. I don't know if you feel the same way as far as officiating. Yeah,
it's not the service itself. It's all the meetings before and loving on everybody after, and yeah, it's just kind of emotionally draining. I tell you this though, I'm sitting at a round table with my cousins and my aunt and my dad, and we're talking about my uncle. His name was Larry, and we talked for like 2 hours about how great he was. There have been moments when I've sat with people and, hey, tell me something great about, your dad, your husband, whatever, and there's silence. And so I was just so blessed, right, to hear all these stories. I have my own stories about him, which is good. And I was just convicted, I want to live in such a way nobody has to lie at my funeral. Yeah. So, but it was a great celebration, and it was good to see my family. And again, thanks for carrying the ball. And Chris, thanks for being better than me on the podcast.
Yeah. So philosophical, let's go biblical philosophical here for just a second.
Okay.
So Solomon writes that it's better to go to a house of mourning than to a house of feasting. In other words, it's better to go to a funeral than to a wedding. Because this is all of our ends, and the living should take it to heart, is how Solomon writes it. Whenever I do a service, I do the exact same thing. I sit down with the family. Okay, tell me about their life, and I just start writing stuff down. And I'm listening, and I'm looking for stories to share that because that's part of the journey, part of the process. But then also, what are the principles for us to learn when it comes to how are we to live our lives based on what we learned from this person's life who's now passed on? So, what were some of the lessons as you're preparing and you're listening to the stories and you're doing this service that you learned as a nephew, but also as a pastor, as a human being from your uncle's life?
Yeah, so that's Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verse 2. I know that because I use that verse in all the funerals that I do. I always tell people there's 3 things you do at a funeral. You celebrate the person's life. You celebrate and remember the grace of God in their life. And you evaluate your own life, which is what you're saying. Some of my earliest childhood memories, my Uncle Larry's there. He was kind of a prankster. I'm like 5 or 6. He taught me how to be a good redneck, right? We had this Jeep, and we would go hunting, and we're all running around. And
I've seen pictures of Chad as a little kid holding dead animals. And
Larry took that picture of me holding the armadillo, and then I'm 6 years old. I've got a dead armadillo in one hand. And a 20 gauge shotgun in the other.
Yeah. So when Chad talks about I grew up, not in the trailer park, but next to it, and you're kind of trying to figure out what is the picture of Chad's childhood, this is the picture that comes to mind whenever Chad talks about his childhood.
Yeah. So I've got an armadillo that I'm holding up, and armadillos are heavy, by the way. And I'm holding that, and I have the gun. My Uncle Larry took that picture, and there's an old Jeep behind us. Mm-hmm. But one particular hunting trip, I'm like 6 years old. We had this old cabin in the middle of nowhere, and I'm standing there getting ready to get in the bunk bed in my underwear, and there's cows outside the window, and they're making noise or whatever. And my Uncle Larry goes, "Hey, you think those are girls out there?" I'm standing there in my underwear looking out the window. He said, "I think they're looking at you. They're looking at you." And then I hear, right? It's just a crystal clear memory from my childhood.
So
I'm glad we're blessing everybody right now.
You guys are all welcome. So what are some of the lessons you learned from Larry?
Honestly, I say this all the time, but it's something that I need to be reminded of. And, it runs a little deeper when you have these experiences. In the end, all that matters is God and people. Mm-hmm. Life's about relationships. He had a special relationship with each of his grandchildren. He had a special relationship with each of his kids. He really showed them his love for them by what he did. He gave and served. Mm-hmm. He just loved people well. He had been married to his wife for 45 years.
Wow.
I'm 48 years old. They got married when they were really young. Mm-hmm. And if I told you how old my aunt was, people would gasp. Should I go ahead and tell you?
Yeah, I figured this is the...
It was another time. It was Texas, and they stayed married. She got married when she was 16.
Wow.
And my uncle was 19.
Wow.
And they've been married for 45 years. And I've watched them go through thick and thin. And one of the things I told my aunt is, your commitment to each other in marriage made a mark on me in a really good way. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm proud of my uncle. You're going to make me cry. I was totally honored to have the privilege to stand up and talk about him. And as always, was honored to talk about Jesus and the grace of Jesus in his life. He wasn't a perfect guy, but he had trusted in a perfect Savior. And so death's a part of life. And it was a good celebration. It was a good remembering and celebrating the grace of God. And it was a good opportunity, to the point of your question, for me to evaluate my own life and just commit myself again to life's about relationships.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in this series, you mentioned in the first week of the series that we're currently in, which is Church People Are the Worst, talking about what does it actually mean to...
Isn't that a great title for a series?
It is.
I see people grimace just a little bit.
They go to one of two extremes. Either they're like, this is going to be the best series ever. Or they're like, what?
I am a church person.
You can't be possibly talking about me.
I told everybody this past week, hey, if that bugs you, just lighten up a little bit, right? You all know a church person that's a jerk. So let's just laugh. And then let's talk about what is a Christian really and what does the Bible actually say? Because there's a lot of people that are really religious, but they're missing out on what matters most according to what the Bible teaches.
Yeah, so, and you mentioned just now following Jesus with your Uncle Larry. And at the first week you said there's some people that Christianity and what they've made that to mean and made that to be, it's void of the one whose name that bears. It's void of Jesus. And if it doesn't have Jesus, it's not Christianity, biblical Christianity. Talk to us a little bit about what is the definition that we should be using? If it's not Christian, what's a better word, a better way to say this is what it means to be a follower?
So the word Christian is only in the Bible a couple of times. Depending on your translation, it might be in there 3 times, but it's never defined. And so kind of the verse that we're looking at as we say what is a Christian, it's from Acts chapter 11. It's verses 25 and 26. But it says the disciples, and when we hear the word disciple, we always think the 12. There are actually hundreds. The word disciple just means a disciplined follower of a master. So these followers of Jesus, it says in verse 26, the disciples were first called Christians in Antioch. And what it was there were outsiders that were looking, what it was. Did you like that?
That's good.
What it was.
We'll just edit out one of the wases.
People outside of this group of people were looking at this group of people going, you guys are acting like Jesus. You're little Jesus Juniors. You're little Christers. you're Christians.
Yeah.
And they were living their lives in such devotion to Jesus that they were doing what Jesus would do if Jesus were in their place. And it was the world that looked at this group of disciples and said, little Jesus Juniors, little Christers, little Christians. And so that's where the term came from.
Yeah, and the series isn't meant to be like disparaging to all churchgoers. That's not what this is.
Of course
there's people within the church who really do exemplify the ways the lifestyle of Jesus. And then there's those
we celebrated a few of those this past weekend.
And then there's those who don't. The challenge is they all have the exact same brand, the exact same title. And they go, oh, you're a Christian. Well, so-and-so says they're a Christian as well. And these lives are totally different from one another.
Well, when you have Mother Teresa saying that she's a Christian, and you have somebody like Adolf Hitler who publicly said he was a Christian, you have to ask yourself,
what is going on?
What does that word mean, right? Because you couldn't get any more polar opposite worldviews than you get in Adolf Hitler and Mother Teresa. So what is the word Christian? Through the years, all kinds of people on the opposite sides of all kinds of issues have called themselves Christian. And basically, at the end of the day, you can kind of make it mean whatever you want it to mean because the Bible doesn't define it. What the Bible talks about, what Jesus came to do, what Jesus said was, follow me, trust in me, believe in me, be a disciple of mine, which means a student or apprentice, learn from me. When you start talking about being a disciple of Jesus, that's very specific. And it's a little bit dangerous.
Yeah.
Because it's clear.
So you shared a story this weekend of Anne Rice, who wandered into this quagmire brand of Christianity. And talk to us just real briefly. Give us the story of her kind of coming to faith in Jesus. And then she got into this thing, evaluated, and just kind of walk us through her journey. So
I read her autobiography. And she is a very bright person. Like I've got my dictionary close by, right? And I kind of mentioned some of that this past weekend. But Anne Rice is most known for the book Interview with a Vampire. She wrote these vampire chronicles.
So kind of a darker author.
Absolutely. That became, she's been called the modern day Edgar Allan Poe. I mean, it's on that level. That Interview with the Vampire became a movie, and Tom Cruise and Brad Pitt and that whole deal. But Anne grew up as in a Catholic home, and then late teenage years, 18, 19, goes off to college, really becomes an agnostic. Even more so, she said, an atheist. She kind of bounced back and forth between those two things. And for 38 years, lived her life that way. Yeah, and if you're listening, an atheist believes there's no God whatsoever. Agnostic, there's a God, but he's totally distant. There's no way to know him and disconnected. And so that's where she was. And of all things, she's an intellectual. She's studying for some different books and things she wants to write. She was always fascinated with Judaism, just because the Jewish faith has survived for thousands of years, right? So she's like, well, that's unique. Because Jews have been scattered all over the world. They've come back together. They got their, they have the Nobody's land. Worshiping Zeus, but people still worshiping Yahweh. What's it about this religion that's lasted? And so she looks into Judaism and, of course, the story of Israel, even up to modern day. And she really got into studying the rebellion that the Jews led just after the time of Jesus. And the Romans wind up destroying the temple, which Jesus prophesied about. And they did that in 70 AD. And she wanted more information on it. And she had always thought that the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that those were written a long time after the life of Jesus, and thus, there probably weren't miracles, but they added those in later. They started telling stories, and then myth, and then legend. All of a sudden, it's like the fishing story where the fish went from this big to now it's this big. That's exactly right. And so she's studying all this, and she says, "Well, I'm going to read the New Testament and see what they say about the war." And nothing was said. And so she's looking at this going, why are they not saying anything about this really important thing, And she came to the conclusion, well, because it hadn't happened yet. When Luke wrote the Gospel of Luke, he was speaking to eyewitnesses. He was giving an account like a journalist. He was interviewing people that experienced it, and he wrote it down. John wrote it in his lifetime. And she starts looking at this through this historical lens of accuracy when it comes to the New Testament, these documents. And she comes to faith. Intellectually and then emotionally, and then what she was taught as a child kind of comes back, and she has a life-changing experience with Jesus. And it was an intellectual journey that became a journey of the heart. And so she talks about all this in her autobiography.
And then, so it's interesting too, as you say, she kind of grew up.
Autobiography, by the way, is called Out of the Darkness.
Okay.
And I'm going to add this. Excuse me for interrupting you. But she said, I think when I was writing the stories of Lestat and Interview with a Vampire and some of those things, I was actually writing about myself and the reality of the darkness of the world without God. And she said, I didn't realize it, but there was a longing in me that once I came to faith, the longing was met.
It's fascinating, and I know that there's more to the story here that we'll get to here quickly, but Brennan Manning, there's this famous quote, number one cause of atheism in America is Christians. And it's not an intellectual thing that gets us into atheism. It's not studying science. In fact, science points to God. It reveals God. And we could do a whole podcast on that. But it's growing up around Christians, whatever that means, and going, there's just something not right here that pushes a lot of people away from what their souls are actually longing for. And it keeps them in darkness, which is the saddest thing in the world, because Jesus is going, hey, you're the light of the world.
Yeah.
And yet we're pushing people or keeping them at bay in the darkness by this title of Christian that doesn't mean a whole lot the same to different people. So let's go back to Anne's story. So she's, okay, I'm part of this thing. But then there's another turning point. There's a little surprise in the story.
I just read this morning, Gandhi said about Christianity, I love Christ, but I don't like Christians very much.
Which, when Gandhi starts saying that, dang.
Yeah. He says, my problem with Christianity is not Jesus. I really like Jesus. It's all you Christians, that I have a problem with. And I'm paraphrasing it. But so Anne gets to this point, and I won't talk about everything I talked about in the sermon. You can go back and listen to the sermon. But basically, she quits Christianity. And she says, I'm still a follower of Jesus.
I'm still devoted to Jesus.
I still have a relationship with God. But I don't want to be called a Christian.
Because that brand can mean anything to anyone on any day.
And there's a whole lot of Christians I don't want to be associated with that group, which is really what we're talking about in the series. What does it mean to be a follower of Jesus? So for a lot of people, they call themselves Christian, but the truth is they don't practice the faith, right? It's Christmas and Easter only. They're CEOs. It's kind of a hobby. But when you start talking about being a disciple of Jesus, suddenly that's not a hobby, that's a way of life.
Yeah.
And so I just, and I heard her story from another pastor a few years ago, and then in preparation for this series, I was reminded of it, and so read her story, but I was just fascinated by her journey. And she and I, to this day, would be on different pages, maybe theologically about some things.
Sure.
But I believe she's a sister in Jesus, and I'll probably never meet her this side of heaven, right? Because I'm just little old me, and she's Anne Rice. But I kind of look forward to being in heaven and talking to her and just asking her some more things about her journey.
Yeah.
It was just really fascinating. She's actually, I'm gonna pitch this. There's an organization, they do videos. It's called I Am Second. And there's all these people that just tell their faith journey. Look up I Am Second.
And I think our
Rice.
smart guys could put a link or something on this podcast. I don't know how all that actually works, but they, I'm looking for a nod or something. Yeah, we'll put a link in there to this.
It's like 10 and a half, 11 minutes of Anne Rice telling her story. And that might be worth a listen to you if you're a fan of the Vampire Chronicles or any of those things. But even if you're not, just to hear the journey of a woman that came to faith intellectually and met God in a real personal way.
Yeah,
powerful. It's a good thing.
Yeah. So the branding of Christianity, the Bible doesn't actually teach that we're to brand ourselves that way. Again, to your point, it was outsiders looking in going, these people are living the way Jesus lived.
Yeah.
But the brand that we're to be known for, kind of to circle it all back around, and this is why we named the podcast what we named it and why we say this all the time, we're to be known by our love for one another. That's the brand, not the T-shirt, bumper sticker, checkbox. I had to fill out a form recently, and it asked, what's your faith? And I had to check off, Christian. But that's not what's to identify us. It's to be our love one for another.
Yeah. Jesus said the world would know us by that. Mm-hmm. And so if you're listening and you're an agnostic, an atheist, you're not sure what you believe maybe, and you're like, well, how do I know a real one, right? A real Christian when I see one, a real follower of Jesus? Well, Jesus said the world would know Christians by their love one for another. Mm-hmm. Actually, he didn't say that. He said the world would know his followers by their love one for another. And yet, in modern Christendom, Christians are kind of known for their...
A lot of other things. Judgmental.
Yeah, being hostile, being judgmental.
Disputatious.
Good word, Robert. All of those kinds of things, which is why Ann said, I'm out.
Yeah.
I don't know that I want to be known as a Christian, but I'm a follower of Jesus. Which begs the question, right? If we were known for our love, would she have said, oh, yeah, no, I'm not in. I don't want to be known for that, right?
Yep.
It's like Jesus has given us this beautiful, wonderful gift, his presence in our lives. And yet through the years, we've put it in this really crappy wrapping paper that nobody wants to open it, right?
Yeah.
So we can do better. So yeah, in the sermon this past weekend, if you didn't listen to it, please go online and do so. We just talk about rebranding the faith. And I talk a little more about Ann and her testimony and what the Bible says about being known for our love.
Yeah. Well, to circle it all back around, let's take account of our lives. Let's be known for our love. Let's evaluate how do people see us? Is that the reputation that we have in our workplace, in our homes, in our families, in our communities? Let's follow Jesus in all of our relationships.
Live in such a way that nobody has to lie about you at your funeral.
Preach it.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us today on the podcast. Hope you enjoyed it. If this is helpful for you, like, share, subscribe, and there's a lot more to come. Thanks, guys.
Thanks for watching this week's episode of the Loving God, Loving People podcast. Make sure you subscribe to this channel and click the bell so that you'll never miss an episode. And while you're at it, if you found value in this conversation, we'd love it if you would like this video, leave us a comment, and even share it with a friend. Doing that will help more people meet, know, and follow Jesus. And lastly, you are always welcome to join us each week for one of our services right here live on YouTube. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.